Happy Valentine's Day, guys. While Valentine's Day is a time for love, affection, and celebration, a day when couples express their devotion through grand gestures, heartfelt words, and shared moments of happiness. But for some, this day of romance is twisted into something far more sinister. For abusers, Valentine's Day can become another tool for manipulation and cruelty, a day to shatter expectations rather than fulfill them. Some intentionally choose this day to inflict the greatest pain, knowing that while others are celebrating love, their victims will be drowning in fear and heartbreak. And in the worst cases, they take things to the extreme. Today, we're going to be looking at 3 tragic cases where what should have been a day of love turned into a day of terror, violence, and loss. The tragic 2009 Valentine's Day murder of Tiana Noce, a case that is nothing short of frustrating. And let me just warn you, this one is going to make you angry because Tiana's death was entirely preventable. There was a clear lead-up to what happened, and Tiana did everything right. She reached out for help multiple times. But despite her best efforts, the very systems that were supposed to protect her failed her over and over again. This case highlights just how important it is for domestic abuse and harassment to always be taken seriously, no matter how minor it might seem at first. Because the truth is, these situations can escalate quickly, and tragically, that's exactly what happened here. Tiana Noce was born on February 4, 1984, in Massachusetts to her parents, Alvin Noce and Kathy Lewis. She had 3 brothers and a stepsister, and from the moment she was born, her mother said she was incredibly alert and tuned into everything happening around her. Even as a baby, she would turn her head at every noise, never wanting to miss a thing. Growing up, Tiana was caring, compassionate, and deeply empathetic. She always looked out for others, whether it was her friends, family, or even complete strangers. But she wasn't just kind. She had a strong, fiery side too. She loved a good debate and was never afraid to argue her point. Her mom even encouraged her to become a lawyer, believing that her intelligence and determination would make her a great one. Tiana was also incredibly creative. She loved music, singing, dancing, and acting. She even wrote her own songs and poetry. Because of her passion for the arts, her family nicknamed her Hollywood. And while most parents naturally believe their child is talented, Tiana truly was. By the time she was in elementary school, it became obvious just how advanced she was. She was miles ahead of her classmates and was moved up not just 1, but 2 grade levels. She was so academically gifted that she started college at the same time she was finishing high school. Tiana was incredibly trusting, charismatic, and always saw the best in people. She was the type of person who would drop everything to help someone in need. This desire to help others carried into her college years. While studying at the University of Hartford, she regularly volunteered at the Women's Center. She even founded a chapter of the Roosevelt Institution on campus, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping students conduct research on policies and present their findings to policymakers in the hopes of creating positive change. Tiana went on to graduate with a bachelor's degree in political science, with dreams of pursuing a career in politics. By 2007, at the age of 23, she had settled in Plainville, Connecticut. She was working full-time as an admissions counselor at a local university, while also working toward her master's degree by attending night classes. It was around this time that she met a man named James Carter II on MySpace. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with MySpace, it was basically the Facebook before Facebook, but way cooler. You could fully customize your profile with themes, music, and even a personal top 8 list of friends. And, of course, everyone had the infamous Tom as their first friend. Tiana had recently come out of a 5-year relationship with her college sweetheart, so she wasn't looking for anything too serious. She made that clear to James, but he was charming and persistent. They chatted online for a while before she finally agreed to meet him in person. James presented himself well. He had a good job as an executive at an insurance company, he owned a house, and more importantly, he treated Tiana like a queen. He showered her with attention and gifts, including a brand new phone that he put on his plan so they could talk whenever they wanted. He even bought her a full set of new tires for her car. At first, everything seemed perfect. Tiana felt lucky to have found such an amazing guy, and she quickly fell for him. She had no idea that beneath the surface, James Carter was hiding a very dark past. 6 months into their relationship, James was suddenly arrested and sentenced to 5 months in jail. Tiana was blindsided. This had come completely out of nowhere. When she looked into it further, she discovered that James had been found guilty of physically abusing his ex-girlfriend. And as it turned out, he had been out on bail the entire time they had been together. He just never bothered to mention it. That alone would have been enough to devastate Tiana, but it didn't stop there. When she dug deeper, she realized this was just the tip of the iceberg. James had a criminal record spanning years, with multiple charges for domestic abuse, assault, harassment, and violating restraining orders taken out against him by previous girlfriends. I can only imagine how devastating it must have been for Tiana to learn that the man she had fallen for was capable of such things. But despite everything, she still gave him another chance when he was released from jail. However, the relationship quickly fell apart. They fought constantly to the point where police were even called at one point. Her father, Alvin, also suspected James was cheating on her. Finally, Tiana had enough. After about a year of dating, she broke things off for good, but James refused to let go. It started with endless calls, texts, and emails. Then, he began stalking her. Tiana would see his car parked outside her apartment complex for hours at a time. If she left to go to work or run errands, he would follow her. He even started showing up unannounced whenever she was out. After weeks of this, Tiana had finally had enough. She confronted James and told him point blank, if he didn't leave her alone, she would have no choice but to get a restraining order. And this is where things took an even more sinister turn. James knew exactly what would happen if Tiana filed a restraining order against him, because he had been through this before. Instead of waiting for her to make a move, he got ahead of it. On January 4th, 2009, he went to the Plainville Police Department and filed for a restraining order against Tiana, accusing her of assaulting him. Tiana was shocked. She strongly denied ever hurting James. And later, when the case went to family court, she made it clear to the judge that the only time she had ever put her hands on him was to push him away. Even the police officer who took James's statement noted that he had no visible injuries and seemed way more focused on getting his belongings back from Tiana's apartment than anything else. The report concluded that there was no reason to believe a crime had even occurred. But unfortunately, James had now weaponized the system against Tiana. And as we'll soon see, it was just the beginning of a horrifying chain of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. The week after James filed his restraining order, Tiana went to the Plainville Police Department to return his belongings and file a restraining order of her own. In her complaint, she stated that James had threatened both her family, and her friends through text messages. It was after this restraining order was put in place that Tiana started receiving disturbing emails. These emails were rambling and disjointed, but the sinister undertones were undeniable. One of them read, "Trust me, baby girl, you are going to lose everything. And as God is my witness, punishment is on the way, so be prepared. And to top things off, you will have bad luck. You hear me? Remember this email when karma bites you in the ass." Despite the threatening nature of the messages, the emails weren't signed by James Carter. Instead, they were sent under the name Jessica Banderas. Tiana, of course, saw right through this. She had never even heard of a Jessica Banderas, but rather than engaging, she printed out the emails and went straight to the Plainville Police Department. She told officers she was certain James was behind them and that he was violating the restraining order. But the response from police was nothing short of infuriating. They told her the emails weren't threatening in nature. Now, I don't know how anyone can read "punishment is on the way, so be prepared" as anything other than a direct threat, but apparently the Plainville Police Department didn't see it that way. When officers questioned James about the emails, he claimed that Jessica Banderas was his new girlfriend and that Tiana had actually been harassing her. According to James, Jessica only sent the emails because she was upset about Tiana's alleged behavior. And somehow, despite having absolutely no proof of these claims, police took James at his word. They let him walk away, free to continue harassing Tiana through texts, emails, and phone calls. Over the next 6 weeks, Tiana returned to the Plainville Police Department more than 30 times to report James for violating the restraining order. Let that sink in. She reported him on average every 1 to 2 days, and yet police refused to take her complaints seriously. Tiana did everything right. She followed the law, she documented the harassment, she reported every single violation. But the very system that was supposed to protect her failed her at every turn. At the end of January, Tiana received a call from the Bloomfield Police Department, a different department about 20 minutes away. They wanted to ask her about a letter that James claimed she had sent him. The letter was supposedly a photo of Tiana with a message written on it that said something along the lines of, "Hey, it's Tiana. Call me." The Bloomfield officer who took the report was immediately suspicious. Why would James's ex-girlfriend feel the need to send him a picture of herself with her name written on it? He obviously knew what she looked like. It didn't add up. And yet, somehow, James's baseless complaint was taken far more seriously than any of Tiana's numerous reports against him. When Tiana told the Bloomfield officers that she had nothing to do with the letter and that she was actually the one being harassed, they sent the letter off for forensic analysis to check for fingerprints. As if that wasn't frustrating enough, another letter, this one supposedly written by Tiana to her former employer, was also being investigated. It turned out that James had forged this letter as well, hoping to get her in trouble at work. And yet, despite obvious evidence that James was attempting to frame her, the police were still dragging their feet. Then, on February 7th, things escalated again. Tiana walked outside her apartment to find that all 4 tires on her car had been slashed. Remember, these were the same tires James had bought for her when they started dating. She immediately went to the Plainville Police Department to report the vandalism, telling them that she had no doubt it was James. And here's where things go from frustrating to absolutely infuriating. Plainville police didn't even investigate. They told her, "Sorry, but there's no way for us to prove that James did it, so there's no point in looking into it." Even if they somehow thought James wasn't responsible, someone had still vandalized her car. That's a crime. But police didn't bother taking fingerprints. They didn't check for surveillance footage. They didn't even question anyone in the area. At this point, Tiana was terrified, and rightfully so. Her father, Alvin, came over that day and installed a security camera outside her apartment. He hoped that when James came back, they would have concrete proof to show police. Less than a week later, on February 13th, the day before Valentine's Day, James called Tiana at work, violating the restraining order yet again. When she realized it was him, she immediately hung up. But James just kept calling. Tiana called the Plainville Police Department to report him, but once again, they refused to help. They told her that since the calls were happening at her workplace, it was outside of their jurisdiction and she needed to report it to Waterbury Police Department instead. So she did. She went straight to the Waterbury Police Department and filed a complaint. The officers there told her to go back to work and wait. They would send someone to follow up. But no one ever showed up. At around 3 p.m., Tiana went back to the police station herself. Shortly after leaving, she called her mother, Kathy, in tears. She was hysterical. She told her mom that when she arrived at the station, she had shown officers her copy of the restraining order, begging them for help. And their response? One of the officers claimed he couldn't find it in the system. He told her that without it in their records, there was nothing they could do. He even went as far as to suggest that her copy of the restraining order was fake. Tiana was devastated, defeated, and completely alone. That night, when she arrived home, she found a letter pinned to her door. It was clearly from James. The letter read, "Tiana, forgive me, I never cheated on you, and if you don't believe me, read Psalms 32. Please, if I'm lying, may God take my life. I never ever cheated. Forgive me for everything else I have done. I'll admit now." For those of you who aren't familiar, Psalm 32 is about a man confessing his sins to God and the joy he feels after being forgiven. So not exactly a great argument for proving your innocence, James. Tiana immediately took the letter to the Plainville Police Department. Officers promised they would investigate and follow up with her as soon as possible. But as you might have guessed by now, they never did. That same night, Kathy called the Waterbury Police Department, the same department that had accused Tiana of having a fake restraining order. She asked to speak with an officer in charge about James's ongoing harassment. And their response? They told her that they were understaffed. It was a long weekend, and they had other cases to deal with. If Tiana still had concerns, she could come back on Tuesday. As if James Carter wasn't actively stalking, harassing, and threatening her. And then came Valentine's Day. That morning, Tiana woke up to several emails that James had sent her overnight. This time, he didn't even bother hiding behind the Jessica Banderas alias. The emails came directly from his account. One of them read, "God told me to write, so don't tell the cops. I'm going through a life or death situation right now, and you are the only one I can talk to. Ever been close to death and thought you were going to die? If I am lying, may the Lord strike me down and kill me tomorrow." And the worst part, Tiana had no idea that this would be her last day alive. It was clear to anyone reading those emails that James was not in a stable frame of mind. He was spiraling and fast. Tiana printed out the messages and went straight to the Plainville Police Department that afternoon, arriving at around 4:30 p.m. And finally, after weeks of reporting James's harassment, it seemed like the police were ready to take action. One of the officers even referred to the emails as apocalyptic and told Tiana they were going to arrest James for violating the restraining order. Tiana was thrilled. She called her friend on the way out of the station, overjoyed and relieved that this nightmare was finally coming to an end. And I wish with everything in me that this was where her story ended. But Plainville police never followed through. Instead of arresting James that night, as they had promised, an officer called him at around 8 p.m. The officer warned James that an investigation was being conducted, and if it was determined that he was responsible for sending the emails and letters to Tiana, a warrant would be issued for his arrest. So, rather than arresting a known repeat offender with 6 weeks of documented violations, police essentially tipped him off. James now knew that Tiana had gone to the police. He knew that she had gone against his warning not to involve law enforcement. And if anyone at the Plainville Police Department had bothered to check his criminal history, they would have seen that this was his pattern. They would have known that he was dangerous. They would have known that he had a history of violence against women. But instead, they handed him one last opportunity to get to Tiana before he could face any consequences. And from the timeline of that night, it's clear that this phone call was the final trigger that pushed James into action. Meanwhile, Tiana believed that James was going to be arrested. She was just waiting to hear confirmation. Her mom, Kathy, told her, "Don't go back to your apartment. It's not safe. We don't know what else James is capable of. Just come and stay with me until he's in custody." Tiana agreed, but she needed a change of clothes, toiletries, and a few other things. So she went back to her apartment that night, planning only to grab a bag and leave. What she didn't know was that James was already there, lying in wait. He had first tried to get a locksmith to let him into Tiana's apartment, claiming he lived there and had lost his keys. When that didn't work, he hid in the shadows by the stairs, waiting for her to return. And the moment she did, he ambushed her. James stabbed Tiana 18 times with such brutality that 2 of the wounds punctured her heart. Then he fled, leaving her to die alone. It had been less than 2 hours since James received that phone call from police. At 9:41 p.m., Tiana somehow managed to call 911. Through sheer willpower, she held on long enough to report her own murder.
I'm bleeding to death!
Where are you?
I'm bleeding to death!
Stay on the phone with me.
My ex-boyfriend just stabbed me to death.
Who's there with you? Who's there with you?
You're not gonna die. You're not gonna die.
I stay on the phone with me.
She told the dispatcher, "I've been stabbed to death by my ex-boyfriend." Neighbors had heard her screams and rushed to help. On the 911 call, you can hear them comforting her, telling her she is going to be okay. First responders arrived and rushed her to the hospital, but Tiana had lost too much blood. At 11:45 p.m., she was pronounced dead. Less than 1 hour later, James Carter II was arrested and charged with murder. But even in jail, he showed no remorse. In letters to his relatives, James mocked Tiana, called her derogatory names, and even said he didn't regret what he had done. He also taunted her family, writing that the notices needed to be taught a lesson. James's trial began in October 2011, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Tiana had identified him herself on the 911 call. Part of the murder had been captured on the security camera that her dad had installed outside her apartment. James's clothes from that night had Tiana's blood on them. Neighbors testified that they had seen James's car leaving the scene. And if all of that wasn't enough, his own brother testified that James had called him after the murder and confessed. One of the most emotional moments in the trial came when Tiana's father, Alvin, took the stand. He read aloud a poem that Tiana had written back when she first discovered James's criminal history. The poem was called Chapter Closed, and in part it read, "Sometimes you want to give a man the benefit of the doubt to prove he is who he says he is." I was disappointed because the words were lies and his actions spoke louder. Let his emptiness comfort him at night. An empty house in solitude is how he will spend his days. James and his legal team didn't deny that he had killed Tiana. There was no way to. Instead, they argued that James had acted in a fit of uncontrollable rage due to emotional stress from their relationship, which, considering everything James had done, is beyond insulting. The jury wasn't buying it. After only 3 hours of deliberation, James was found guilty of first-degree murder. He had multiple outbursts during the trial, especially when his own brother testified against him. But when it came time for sentencing, James refused to show up. He couldn't even face the 40-plus family members and friends of Tiana who had come to see justice served. The judge sentenced James to the harshest penalty available, 60 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. He also received a concurrent 5-year sentence for violating the restraining order.
A man will be sentenced today for killing his ex-girlfriend on Valentine's Day. It all happened back in 2009. News 8's Kent Pierce live in New Britain this morning with details. Good morning, Kent.
Good morning, Ann and Chris. James Carter could get up to 65 years in prison for murder later today, but just as important as making sure he never hurts anybody again is the fact that this case actually helped strengthen state laws to try to prevent anybody else from doing what he did. Now, Carter and Tiana Noce were a couple. They broke up. He took it badly. She got a restraining order against him, but it didn't help. On Valentine's Day 2009, he chased her down outside her Plainville apartment and stabbed her 18 times. There were surveillance pictures. Her blood was on him. She was able to call 911 and say her ex-boyfriend had done it. A jury convicted him of murder and violating the restraining order earlier, actually a couple of months ago, this past November. Her family became vocal in the fight to strengthen Connecticut's domestic violence laws that now include electronic monitoring of domestic violence offenders. Her family also started the Tiana Noce Foundation. According to the foundation website, they have rented a bus, chartered a bus to bring dozens of supporters here for the sentencing later today. Live outside New Britain Court, I'm Kent Pierce, News 8.
Connecticut man who stabbed his ex-girlfriend 18 times was sentenced to 60 years today. 31-year-old James Carter Jr. was not in the courtroom when that sentence was handed down. In 2009, Carter waited outside Tiana Noce's apartment and brutally killed her with a knife. Outside court, her father showed a note he got from Carter that said it was an apology with a question mark.
60 years is not enough, but I understand it's the law. But to me, 60 years is not enough.
Carter could have faced 65 years, but he got 60. That case led to stricter domestic violence laws.
Tiana's friends and family were relieved at the verdict, but their grief remained unbearable. Kathy later admitted that when she arrived at the hospital that night, her first reaction was anger at God. How could you let this happen? For Alvin, the first thought in his mind was, who did this? But he already knew the answer, and he was determined to make sure that no other young woman suffered the same fate. After Tiana's murder, Alvin and Kathy founded the Tiana Angelique Notice Foundation to help victims of domestic violence more. They pushed for better legal protections, more police accountability, and stronger action from lawmakers. One of their biggest achievements was the passage of a law allowing GPS tracking of serial domestic abusers, so that if they came too close to their victims, police would be alerted before another tragedy could happen. Alvin also began installing security cameras at the homes of domestic violence survivors for free. In April 2014, Tiana's estate was awarded $10 million in a wrongful death lawsuit against the Plainville and Waterbury police departments. A jury found that law enforcement had been negligent, particularly the officer who called James and warned him instead of arresting him. And that brings us to the end of Tiana's story. It's an infuriating case, and even with justice served, it will never feel like enough. Tiana deserved better. She did everything right, and the system failed her. May she rest in peace. Hey guys, just a quick interruption to ask you all a favor. If you could please hit that like button, it would really help me out a lot. It's much appreciated. Thank you. Now let's get back to these cases. Jodine Elizabeth Sarin was born on November 21, 1967, in Glendale, California, to her parents, Arthur and Lois Sarin. She was one of 6 children, growing up alongside her siblings Michael, Nancy, Barbara, Carol, and Chuck. To those closest to her, she was Jody. Jodine had a kind and gentle soul, described by her family and friends as friendly, sweet, shy, and trusting. She deeply loved animals, especially her white horse, Sam, and her beloved cat, Angel. She was also incredibly creative, writing poetry, making crafts, and excelling in floral design, a skill she eventually earned a certificate in after her family relocated to Carlsbad, California. Despite facing mental disabilities, with some reports mentioning schizophrenia and learning difficulties, Jodine lived an independent and active life. She thrived in her community, volunteering at her church and the Humane Society, participating in the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, and dedicating herself to fundraising efforts. She also enjoyed ice skating, biking, kayaking, and horseback riding, often competing in county fairs. Though she relied on her parents for transportation, she was otherwise self-sufficient and took great pride in her home on Swallow Lane in Carlsbad, where she had been living independently for the past decade. Jodine was extremely close to her parents, and they maintained frequent contact, always checking in on her. Life was going well for her, until everything took a horrific turn on Valentine's Day 2007. On the evening of February 14, 2007, Arthur and Lois Sarin went out for dinner and a theater show to celebrate Valentine's Day. But something felt off. Lois had an unshakable sense of unease. Jodine hadn't called or texted much that day, which was unlike her. So on their way home, they decided to stop by her condo to check in. They arrived at Jodine's home around 10 p.m. The lights inside were on, but when they knocked, she didn't answer. They knocked again, still nothing. Starting to worry, Arthur used their spare key to unlock the door, but the latch was still in place. This was out of the ordinary. Now in full panic mode, Arthur forced the door open, breaking the lock in the process. As they stepped inside, everything appeared normal. The condo wasn't ransacked and nothing seemed out of place. The lights were on and there were no immediate signs of distress, but Jodine was nowhere to be seen. Thinking she might be asleep or in the shower, Arthur and Lois made their way toward her bedroom. They opened the door and saw Jodine, naked, with a man on top of her, seemingly engaged in sex. Horrified and embarrassed, Arthur and Lois immediately turned away, assuming they had walked in on their daughter's intimate moment with a partner. They hurriedly told the couple to get dressed while retreating to another part of the condo to give them privacy. But as the minutes passed and neither of them emerged, Arthur grew suspicious. He called out, but there was no response. Finally, he stepped back into the bedroom. The man was gone, and Jodine was motionless, cold to the touch. A sickening realization set in. She was dead. Arthur and Lois frantically called 911. A dispatcher instructed them to move Jodine to the floor and begin CPR, but it was already too late. Their daughter had been murdered. And worse, the man they had walked in on had been using her lifeless body. When police arrived, they immediately cordoned off the crime scene and began piecing together the details of Jodine's final moments. There were no signs of forced entry. No windows or doors had been broken, suggesting that Jodine had let her killer in willingly. She was known for being extremely trusting, which made her vulnerable. It was also clear that the suspect had spent a significant amount of time in the condo, arranging the scene exactly how he wanted it. Jodine had a habit of asking visitors to remove their shoes at the door, and police found a pair of men's shoes left behind, likely abandoned in the suspect's rush to escape. Investigators discovered that a meal had been shared, implying that Jodine and the killer had spent some time together before the attack. The living room remained undisturbed, but her bedroom was a scene of pure horror. Blood covered the bed linens and splattered the walls and bathroom. A full-length mirror had been deliberately placed to face the bed, so the killer could watch himself as he defiled her body. The windows had been covered with sheets, likely to prevent anyone from looking in. Bloody footprints indicated that the killer had walked around after the attack, reinforcing the belief that he wasn't in a hurry to leave. Jodine had fought hard. Her body was covered in defensive wounds. The autopsy confirmed she had been bludgeoned and strangled to death, suffering blunt force trauma to the head. Even more disturbing, it appeared the killer had cut her post-mortem, with an incision found on her neck. Her time of death was estimated to be around noon on February 14th, meaning she had been dead for at least 10 hours before her parents found her. That also meant that the man they had walked in on hadn't just been sexually assaulting Jodine, he had been committing necrophilia. Investigators immediately collected DNA evidence from the crime scene and Jodine's body. They ran it through the state's criminal database, hoping for a match, but there were no hits. Meanwhile, a neighbor, Samantha Raymond, reported seeing a man running away from the condo complex that night. He had been moving at such a frantic speed that she hadn't been able to get a clear look at his face. Arthur, still in shock, told police that the man he had seen in Jodine's bedroom seemed vaguely familiar. He believed he recognized him from her social circles. This led police to investigate Robert Burns, a man who frequently attended the same events as Jodine. He was questioned and provided a DNA sample, but it didn't match. Surveillance footage later confirmed his alibi, showing him riding a bus at the time of the murder. With no suspects left, authorities turned to the public for help. A composite sketch of the killer, based on Arthur's description, was released. Arthur and Lois made heartbreaking pleas for answers. Somebody, somewhere knows something, and eventually it's going to come out, Anitra Sarin said. We need to know this evil person is caught and will never be able to commit another horrendous crime, Lois Sarin added. But months turned into years. Despite hundreds of tips and leads, the case remained at a dead end. Police continued testing DNA from potential suspects, but every comparison came back negative. Jodine's murder remained a mystery. For years, Jodine's parents never gave up hope that her killer would one day be caught. A $52,000 reward was offered for any information leading to an arrest, but as the years passed, the case remained cold.
The killer left behind DNA evidence, but investigators couldn't find a match in the National Criminal Database. The case is at a standstill.
I know Art and Lois are surprised. It's a hard thing to tell them not that we don't have any more info. There's no new developments on this case.
That's why Jody's parents are hoping someone will come forward.
By 2015, 8 years after their daughter's murder, 85-year-old Art and 80-year-old Lois were still fighting for answers. They raised money, handed out flyers, and even had Jodine's case displayed inside buses, constantly hoping for a break. Lois feared that the man who had taken her daughter's life could still be out there, free to harm someone else. This is 8 years now, and you think somebody would know something. This monster could be dead, and we will never know. But after a decade of waiting, their long-awaited breakthrough finally arrived. In 2017, with no database matches for the killer's DNA, investigators turned to a groundbreaking forensic tool, DNA phenotyping. This new technology used artificial intelligence to predict a suspect's physical appearance, including likely eye, hair, and skin color, as well as ancestry and facial structure. Through Parabon nanolabs, detectives were able to generate a digital composite image based on the genetic material left at the crime scene. On the 10th anniversary of Jodine's murder, police released the image to the public. The analysis suggested that the suspect was a Caucasian male in his 30s or 40s with fair skin, green or blue eyes, blonde or brown hair, and some freckles. Parabon nanolabs provided investigators with 7 to 8 possible names, all matching the genetic profile. Among them was David Mabrito, but because his last name suggested Mediterranean rather than European descent, he was placed at the bottom of the list. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, an expert in forensic genealogy, took the investigation a step further. She ran the DNA sample through WISE-TR databases, which focus on paternal lineage, hoping to find a last name match. Her search suggested a surname like Miracle or Markel, but after checking profiles with those last names, none fit the crime's timeline. It wasn't until genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, who had helped identify the Golden State Killer, stepped in that everything changed. Using the killer's DNA and the Miracle surname, she uploaded the genetic data to GED Match, a public ancestry database. She got a hit. One name surfaced again, David Mabrito. The reason he hadn't been identified sooner? Adoptions had taken place in the Miracle family, which had altered last names over generations. But DNA never lies. Now the question remained, was David Mabrito truly Jodine's killer? In November 2018, David Mabrito was officially identified as the prime suspect in Jodine's murder. At the time of the crime, Mabrito was 38 years old, a transient meth addict suspected of other violent crimes. Investigators raced to locate him, hoping to confirm his involvement and obtain a direct DNA match. But they quickly hit a dead end. Mabrito had taken his own life in 2011, just 4 years after Jodine's murder. He had overdosed on drugs at 42 years old, leaving behind an ex-wife, Marissa, and their son, Dylan. With no way to test David directly, detectives turned to his family, hoping they would agree to provide DNA samples. Horrified by the possibility that David could be responsible for such a horrific crime, Marissa and Dylan still bravely agreed to cooperate. Dylan provided a DNA sample to law enforcement.
He came to us and said that I believe the DNA from my swab matched, I think it was, and they ended up pulling something with genealogy, and it ended up being my dad, so it was very heavy. And
I thought, there's no way. There was just no way. I still have a hard time wrapping my head around it.
As detectives spoke with Marissa, she noticed an image of the shoes left at Jodine's crime scene. Immediately, she recognized them.
Saw a photocopy picture of shoes, and I asked to see them. And as soon as I see them, my gut knew.
In 2011, he had matched the description of a suspect in an unrelated crime and was asked to provide a DNA sample. A police officer took a swab and photographed Mabrito, but then let him go. 1 week later, he was dead. Investigators now believe that Mabrito took his own life because he feared being linked to Jodine's murder once his DNA was in the system. Shockingly, the sample was never logged in the national database, which is why he was never identified sooner. Determined to get definitive proof, investigators tracked down the original DNA sample and sent it for forensic testing. After 11 years, the case was finally solved. The DNA analysis concluded that David Mabrito's profile was a match, with a 1 in 64 quintillion chance that anyone else could be responsible. Lieutenant Greg Corin stated that while police were certain Mabrito was the killer, they could never determine if Jodine knew him or if he had simply targeted her. He stated, "There's nothing to indicate the nature of their relationship. How they crossed paths is unfortunately lost with the people involved." Though we'll never truly know what happened that night, police suspect Mabrito was high on meth when he entered Jodine's home. They believe the attack began as a sexual assault before escalating to murder and necrophilia until he was interrupted by her parents. After 11 long years, Jodine's case was finally closed. Carlsbad Police Chief Neil Gallucci issued a statement, "We are thankful to provide a resolution to Jodine's family. We never forgot Jodine, and we are grateful to have identified the person responsible for her tragic murder." Jodine's family also released a heartfelt statement. "Jodine taught us all with her perseverance and love of nature. There was joy in her laughter, love in her heart, and faith in her soul." The Sarin family is forever grateful to the Carlsbad Police Department for their dedication to justice.
They gave us a name, they showed us a picture, but it was just almost too much to handle at that time. It just took a while to really understand that they really found the person that did this horrific crime.
I felt anger that it took this long, but I was relieved that this was finally identified. That was a good feeling. We felt that this finally solved the case.
One of the most remarkable acts of courage came from Marissa and Dylan. When detectives told Lois and Art who the killer was, Lois's first question wasn't about her own pain. It was about Dylan. How is he doing? She knew that learning your own father was a murderer was an unimaginable burden to bear.
I want them to feel like their daughter's free, because going on almost, 10 years that they haven't heard anything back from the police. They know nothing.
The truth will always come out, and the right thing to do is always the right thing to do. Two things happened with this case. Jodine has peace, and we had an answer as to why he killed him. Because for almost 8 years, we blamed ourselves. I blamed myself.
In 2019, the District Attorney's Office honored Marissa and Dylan with a Citizens of Courage Award for their bravery in helping solve the case. Marissa later revealed that she had blamed herself for David's suicide for years. To find out that it was because he thought he was about to be caught, it was almost a relief. But not everyone was kind. Marissa faced online harassment, with people falsely accusing her of knowing what David had done. She even had to turn off her phone to escape the attacks. While this case has a resolution, true justice will never be served. David Mabrito escaped punishment, and Jodine's family was left with painful, unanswered questions. But the person who truly deserves to be remembered is Jodine Sarin. May she rest in peace. In the winter of 2020, Anitra Gunn was just 23 years old and a senior at Fort Valley State University in Fort Valley, Georgia. A graduate of Westlake High School in Atlanta, she had worked hard to pursue her education despite facing challenges early in life. After the passing of her mother when she was still a child, Anitra and her younger brother were raised by their father, Christopher Gunn. In 2016, Anitra relocated to Fort Valley to study agriculture at FVSU. Between being a full-time student and working part-time as a server at 1836 Restaurant and Lounge, she kept busy. She was known as fun-loving, kind-hearted, and deeply loyal to her family and friends, always staying in close contact with them, especially her father back in Atlanta. On the morning of February 14, 2020, Valentine's Day, Anitra's best friend, Sierra Stewart, woke up late to find a series of messages from her. Their conversation started normally, with them exchanging Happy Valentine's Day messages. But soon Sierra received uncharacteristic texts that seemed odd for Anitra. The messages implied that she was planning to meet up with someone she vaguely referred to as dude. Sierra knew Anitra was in an on-and-off relationship with 22-year-old U.S. Army Sergeant DeMarcus Little, but this message suggested she was meeting someone else. Sierra, who was never fond of DeMarcus, didn't think much of it at first. Their relationship had been unstable, and she had always felt that DeMarcus was bad news. But as the hours passed, her concern for Anitra grew. By midday, she was contacted by a mutual friend named David Howard, also known as Scoot. He had also been receiving strange messages from Anitra's phone that morning. DeMarcus, on the other hand, claimed he had no idea where Anitra was. Something felt terribly wrong. Sierra quickly reached out to Anitra's father, Christopher Gunn, in Atlanta. Worried sick, Christopher immediately called for a welfare check at his daughter's home on West Church Street. When Fort Valley police arrived, they found no one inside. Even more troubling, her car, a 2013 white Chevy Cruze, was also missing. By this time, the texts from Anitra's phone had completely stopped. The last activity from her phone was between 8:30 a.m. and 11 a.m., first messaging Scoot, then Sierra. After that, nothing. Calls and texts from concerned friends and family went unanswered. When Christopher arrived in Fort Valley, he formally reported his daughter missing. A task force was quickly formed, consisting of the Fort Valley Police Department, the Peach County Sheriff's Office, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI. The last confirmed sighting of Anitra was at the home of her boyfriend's friend's aunt on Chestnut Hill Road. She had spent the night of February 13th there. That meant DeMarcus Little was the last person to see her before she disappeared. Immediately, the public and media began to speculate about his involvement.
This is the last place she was seen Thursday night about 11:30.
Okay.
The aunt confirmed she was here with her boyfriend. It's the last place she was seen. So what we're doing today is basically we're fixing to search this house to make sure there's nothing there that we need to see. And we're just going to start from here and work our way out. We've got the GSP helicopter flying the woods. Just looking for anything we can find. Right now, everybody that knew her is a person of interest until we're kind of whittling that list down.
Has the boyfriend been questioned?
Yes, ma'am.
He's not in custody, is he?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
The night before she went missing, Anitra had attended a house party with some girlfriends. She left the party around 11 p.m. with her friend, Tracy King, her sometimes boyfriend, DeMarcus Little, and his close friend, Jivon Abron. After leaving the party, the group went to DeMarcus's house for a few hours. At some point, after 2 a.m., Jivon dropped Anitra and DeMarcus off at her house on West Church Street so she could grab her car. From there, they went to Waffle House for a late-night meal before heading back to the Chestnut Hill Road home, where they spent the night. According to DeMarcus, he last saw Anitra leaving the house at around 11:30 a.m. on Valentine's Day. He claimed she was heading to a job interview, so he didn't think much of it. However, there was a major flaw in his story. Anitra did have an interview scheduled that morning, at 9:30 a.m. If she had left at 11:30 a.m., she would have already been 2 hours late. Detectives wasted no time bringing DeMarcus in for questioning. They also impounded his vehicle, a black 2019 Toyota Corolla with red pinstripes, for forensic examination. DeMarcus had grown up in Fort Valley and joined the Army in 2016. By December 2019, he had been stationed at Fort Eisenhower, formerly Fort Gordon, in Augusta, working as a unit supply specialist. On paper, he seemed like a stable and respectable young man. But as investigators spoke to Anitra's friends and family, they heard a very different story. Their relationship had been toxic for months. While DeMarcus's friends painted him as a devoted boyfriend, Anitra's loved ones saw a different side, one filled with control, jealousy, and tension.
Thing happened because they said they.
I don't know, but it's God got this. God, He the judge and the jury.
When you're innocent, you stain.
You guys think he's innocent?
Yes, no doubt. We know
It's a fact, baby.
Very close relationship with her. She was just like a niece to me.
A major break in the case came when Anitra's 2013 white Chevy Cruze was discovered just a few blocks from her home. The front bumper was missing, and there was mud and debris stuck to the tires. Just the day before, Jivon had driven past the car with DeMarcus. Jivon pointed it out, asking, "Isn't that Anitra's car?" DeMarcus dismissed the question, insisting it wasn't hers. Inside the car, police found Anitra's wallet and keys, but there was one crucial item missing: her cell phone. Forensic analysis of the car revealed DeMarcus's fingerprints and palm prints inside and on the trunk. DNA evidence also showed traces of Anitra inside his vehicle. While this wasn't necessarily incriminating, they had been in a relationship, it still raised suspicion. Then, just 24 hours into the search for Anitra, DeMarcus made a bizarre admission. He claimed that Anitra had accidentally shared her phone location with him the day before she disappeared. When he checked, her phone had pinged near her home on West Church Street. However, when Officer Whitehead of the Fort Valley Police Department reviewed the location data, he found something different. Her phone had actually pinged further south, on Carver Drive. Acting on this information, investigators rushed to the location. They found Anitra's cell phone there, tucked inside the end of a drainage pipe. The county, city, and state task force pressed on in their search for Anitra, covering vast areas from Chestnut Drive through dense woodland. Rain or shine, they remained dedicated to finding her. When weather conditions became too dangerous for helicopters, deputies continued scouring rough terrain on foot, determined to uncover any clues. During one of these searches, a Peach County Sheriff's deputy noticed a path leading off the main roadway that appeared recently disturbed, tire tracks weaving through the trees. He stepped out of his patrol car and began following the trail on foot. The further he walked, the more signs he found: bent branches, damaged vegetation, and clear indications that a vehicle had swiped against nearby trees. Then, under a thin covering of tree limbs and brush, he spotted something, a body, poorly concealed among the trees. Nearby, he also discovered broken car parts, including what appeared to be a bumper from a 2013 white Chevy Cruze.
Today at 3:19, deputies and members of the task force were out riding because of the weather. We couldn't get the helicopter up, so they were just riding, looking. We had an idea of the bushes and sticks that were in the front of the grill of her car. So the deputies were kind of looking for those areas. The area he found her at, he saw something similar, a little roadway going down into the woods. Rode down in till the car wouldn't go anymore because of the rain. About 150 yards off the roadway, he found the piece of the car, part of the car piece that we've been looking for. Found Miss Gunn laying very close to part of that front bumper.
How long have any persons of interest?
I think it's pretty common sense who our person of interest is.
Can you say it though out loud?
It's the boyfriend.
An autopsy later confirmed that Anitra had been strangled. There was also evidence that she had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. The position of her body in the disturbed ground suggested that she had been dragged to where she was ultimately found. On Wednesday, February 19th, just a few days after her body was discovered, DeMarcus Little was arrested. However, at this stage, he was not yet charged with murder. Instead, authorities charged him with criminal damage to property related to an incident that occurred at Anitra's house 2 weeks before her death. At around 3 a.m. on February 5th, Anitra and her friend Scoot, who was staying over, were jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. Initially, they dismissed it, thinking a pet might have knocked something over. But in the morning, after Scoot left, Anitra made a disturbing discovery. Her car's tires had been slashed, and bricks had been hurled through 2 of her windows. When she reported the incident to the police, she claimed she had no idea who could have done it. However, this wasn't the first time someone had punctured her tires in the middle of the night. It didn't take long for investigators to find out the truth. DeMarcus had done it. In a fit of rage after discovering that Anitra had a male friend staying over, he lashed out, vandalizing her property. He eventually admitted to his actions, but continued to insist that he had nothing to do with her murder.
Your son is a person of interest, also that this Anitra's death. What do you want to tell people?
Basically, we're here today for granted bond hearing for criminal damage to property, and we're just glad that he was granted bond for that particular matter, and so he can get back to his career in the United States Army. But it just hurt me to see him come in shackles like that, like he's a criminal. My son's never done anything to anyone. He didn't do this incident. I can sympathize with the family, I truly do. I have daughters. I even have one in college, and something like that would happen to her, I would be devastated. But my son didn't do this. He was raised the right way. He's not violent, never been in a fight, never having a criminal background. He's a good kid, a good soldier, serving our country proudly.
Does it annoy you that he's a person of interest?
It mostly annoys me how certain media and social media and certain people in society have destroyed him and slandered his name. They don't really know the real DeMarcus Little. The real DeMarcus Little is a very humble young man. He made sergeant 3 years in the United States Army. He doesn't have anything on his background, any blemishes, nothing. Nobody can't say nothing bad about my son. He's been here on this earth 22 years, and can't no one say anything terrible about my son.
The Army sergeant was granted a $10,000 bond with an ankle monitor. But before he could walk free, another charge was added: malice murder. He wasn't the only one arrested. His close friend, Javon Abram, was also taken into custody on 2 counts of making false statements and 1 count of concealing a death. When DeMarcus's trial began in March 2022 at the Peach County Courthouse, it was his former best friend, someone he once called a brother, who became the prosecution's key witness. Defense attorney Benjamin Davis argued that DeMarcus was an upstanding, humble man, a dedicated soldier who had no history of violence. But prosecutor Neil Halverson painted a very different picture, one of a controlling, manipulative, and possessive boyfriend who refused to let go. The romance that had once seemed ideal had turned toxic, one that Anitra had desperately tried to escape. Days of trial testimony focused on the messages Anitra and DeMarcus had exchanged in the months leading up to her death. She repeatedly described him as evil and manipulative. She told him she was exhausted by his threats and his emotional abuse. She tried to cut ties, but every time he managed to work his way back into her life. DeMarcus, on the other hand, constantly accused Anitra of being with another man. In early November, she told him they should stop speaking altogether. She pointed out that every time they talked, she felt manipulated. Days later, DeMarcus threatened to take his own life. He told her she had pushed him to that point. Then, after hours of ignoring her messages, he finally responded. His suicide attempt had failed. But his tactic had worked. Anitra, worried for his safety, re-engaged with him. Their communication continued on and off, with DeMarcus growing increasingly possessive. On her birthday, he cryptically messaged her, telling her he was sparing the man he thought she was seeing that night. Even though they were no longer together, he continued making threats. At one point, he even sent Anitra a screenshot of a message he had written to an unknown individual. He had offered this person $200 to handle the man he believed she was dating. "We're going to have problems if you go out with him. OM," he wrote, meaning on my mama, a slang term meaning he was dead serious. At other times, he was even more direct. His messages made it clear that his patience had limits. His mercy had limits. David Scoot Howard, a barber who worked across the street from the 1836 restaurant and lounge where Anitra had worked as a server, was one of the last people to communicate with her. The 21-year-old lived just a few doors down from her house on West Church Street, and they often kept in touch. On the morning of February 14th, Scoot realized he had left his second phone at Anitra's house the night before. He needed it for work, so he sent her a quick message asking if she could check for it. The response he received was strange. Instead of simply confirming whether the phone was there, the message from Anitra's number instructed Scoot to send his location so she could drive over and bring it to him. but Scoot said that didn't make sense. Scoot explained that his house was so close to Anitra's that he could stand at the end of his driveway and see her front door. She knew exactly where he lived. There was no need for her to ask for his location, and she certainly wouldn't have needed to drive over to him. Scoot knew something was off. The messages he received that morning didn't sound like Anitra. When he tried calling, she didn't pick up. Instead, another message came through. "I just can't talk right now." Then things got even stranger. The next text seemed to be breaking up with him, but Scoot and Anitra weren't even in a relationship. Confused, Scoot responded, saying that was fine, but he wasn't sure what was going on. He barely even knew Anitra. They had only hung out a couple of times, and he hesitated to even call them friends. It felt like whoever was texting was trying to create distance, but why? Then, the person using Anitra's phone asked again for his address, saying they were on their way to him. That's when Scoot noticed something. Standing outside his house, he saw a 2019 black Toyota Corolla with red pinstripes circling his block. Again and again, at least 5 or 6 times. It felt like someone was watching him. Alarmed, he messaged Anitra's best friend, Sierra Stewart, telling her about the strange texts and suspicious behavior. He also made a smart move. He sent her the car's license plate number. Later, police would confirm the car belonged to none other than DeMarcus Little. On Sunday, February 16th, just 2 days after Anitra went missing, DeMarcus and his close friend Jivon Abron left church together and went for a drive. As they rode in the car, DeMarcus made a shocking confession. He told Jivon that he had strangled Anitra the night before she disappeared. According to Jivon, DeMarcus said he had been pouring his heart out to Anitra, telling her they were soulmates and professing his love for her. But instead of responding the way he wanted, she laughed at him. DeMarcus told Jivon that he blacked out after that. Jivon recalled DeMarcus's words in court. "I was pouring my heart out to her, talking to her, trying to tell her how much I love her, and she laughed in my face. I don't know what happened. I blacked out and I hit her. After that, I grabbed her and started choking her. At one point, she just stopped fighting. She wanted to be home. She wanted to go with her mama." The following day, Jivon unwittingly helped DeMarcus cover up the murder. Jivon had picked him up near the area where Anitra's abandoned car would later be found. He had no idea at the time, but DeMarcus had already disposed of her body. DeMarcus later explained to Jivon how he had placed Anitra's body in the trunk of her car, driven her out to the remote woods of Crawford County, and left her there. At some point, the car's front bumper had fallen off on the rough terrain. He then returned to Fort Valley, parked the vehicle a few blocks from her home, and called Jivon for a ride. Jivon had even pointed out Anitra's car that day, asking DeMarcus if it was hers since the front bumper was missing. DeMarcus had played it cool, casually brushing it off, insisting it wasn't hers. The following morning, DeMarcus still had Anitra's cell phone. He used it to send misleading messages to Scoot and Sierra before finally discarding it inside a drainage pipe. Later, he and Jivon drove out to Greer Road, near the Peach County-Crawford County line, where Anitra's body had been left. When Jivon saw her lifeless form in the woods, he was in complete shock. He even refused to get out of the car. DeMarcus, however, had one more task to complete. He retrieved the detached portion of Anitra's front bumper, which was still sitting near the crime scene, and asked Jivon to help him push it into the trunk. The two then drove further out and disposed of it in a ditch off another road. That same bumper was later recovered in the exact location Jivon described, further corroborating his testimony. Cell phone location data provided even more damning evidence. Both Jivon's and DeMarcus's devices pinged in the exact locations described in Jivon's account. But DeMarcus's version of events, it didn't match at all.
So every single cache location that we just talked about accurately showed where you were.
Those my whereabouts where I went, where I drove, yes ma'am.
So those same cache locations show at 103, you driving on Tanglewood Road, headed toward Greer Road. Is that correct?
No ma'am.
So your phone went offline at that point?
I know where I went.
And then those same cache locations, which were right from noon until 1 o'clock and from 2:20 for the rest of the day, they then show you in the woods off Greer Road, correct?
No.
They don't show you there?
I wasn't in the woods.
No, that wasn't my question. My question was, do those cache locations, which you just testified were absolutely accurate with regards to your whereabouts between 12 and 1 and 2:20 to the rest of the night, those same cache locations show you in the woods off Greer Road, don't they?
Those were inaccurate.
Just those?
Yes.
But your phone shows you going from 420 Chestnut Hill Road to the woods off of Greer Road. Isn't that what happened, sir?
No.
And you got back in Anitra's car and you drove it over ditches and trees, causing the bumper to fall off, causing everything else to break apart, and you dumped your soulmate like garbage in the middle of the woods, didn't you, sir?
No, ma'am.
Just like your phone said you did. And then you drove back down her beaded car with a missing bumper and the missing wheel well, and you dumped her car just like you dumped her at the corner of Bell and Montrose, didn't you, sir?
No, ma'am.
Just like your phone said you did.
No, ma'am.
So your phone is lying.
Assistant District Attorney Don Baskin challenged DeMarcus on the discrepancies in his timeline. Cell phone data placed him leaving his aunt's house on Chestnut Drive and traveling toward Greer Road, where Anitra's body was ultimately found, on the morning of Valentine's Day. Yet when DeMarcus testified, he insisted that while his phone data was accurate at all other times that morning, it was somehow incorrect during the crucial time when Anitra was being dumped in the woods. His alibi quickly unraveled when he tried to explain his whereabouts later that morning. Initially, he told police that he was at home around 11:30 a.m. when Anitra left his aunt's house, but his messages to Sierra at that time contradicted this. He had told her he was out looking for Anitra. David Scoot Howard also saw DeMarcus's car circling the block in Fort Valley around the same time.
What were you doing driving in your car, circling the block around where David Howard lived between 11:30 and 12:15?
I told you I went to look for Anisha.
Why? She left you 5 minutes before.
Because I want to see this she goes to me.
So when Anitra left, you followed her?
I don't remember the exact time, but
It's so hard, isn't it? You just told the jury a few minutes ago that you were actually just hanging out at the house. That didn't answer my question, sir. My question to you was, what did you do between 11 a.m. and 12:15?
I can't remember that.
You can't remember what you were doing.
I know I was at the house.
Okay. So when you say, I'll be back, you actually did leave the house then, correct?
Just moved.
Okay. And you did get in your car, and you did drive repeatedly by David Howard's address.
Correct. I don't know his exact address. I drove around the location.
And you were doing that with Anitra's phone, correct?
No, ma'am.
It's weird because Anitra was texting David Howard at the exact same time. You're driving around asking where he is and what he looks like. You know, weird. It's like a coincidence. That's what we use before. You ever heard the old saying, the simplest explanation is usually the truth?
The jury deliberated for just 3 hours. They had 3 counts to consider: malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. If they believed DeMarcus killed Anitra in a moment of rage, they could convict him of felony murder, which applies when a person is killed during the commission of another felony, like assault. But the prosecution argued that this wasn't just a heat-of-the-moment crime. This was a calculated act, one that stemmed from DeMarcus's deep-seated obsession with control. Either way, both murder counts carried the same potential sentence.
Count 1, malice murder, read the jury find DeMarcus Devontae Little not guilty. For count 2, felony murder, read the jury find DeMarcus Devontae Little guilty. Count 3, aggravated assault, read the jury find DeMarcus Devontae Little guilty.
In the end, the state requested the only sentence they deemed appropriate for Anitra Gunn's murder: life without the possibility of parole. The judge agreed. In March 2022, DeMarcus Little was sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in prison. Following the verdict, Assistant District Attorney Don Baskin spoke publicly about a concern the state had when selecting jurors for the case. They worried that some jurors might not hold DeMarcus fully accountable because Anitra had continued to return to him despite his increasingly volatile behavior. Baskin described it as the frog in boiling water effect. Had Anitra been thrown into a clearly abusive situation from the start, she would have immediately left. But the abuse escalated gradually, bit by bit, until it became dangerously normalized. By the time she realized the full extent of the danger, it was too late.
The picture that we wanted to paint was that despite the frustrating nature of domestic violence, especially from those of us that are sitting on the outside, that is to never give up, to keep fighting, to remind the individual who's in the cycle that they're in a dangerous pot of water and that it's going to come to a boil.
While these cases are truly heartbreaking, they are the extreme. Love should never come with fear or control. Valentine's Day is meant to be a celebration of love and affection, but it's important to remember that love isn't just about one day. It's about showing kindness, care, and appreciation for each other every single day. So look after one another, support those around you, and never take love for granted. If you enjoy this content, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps me out and helps to share the stories of these 3 women whose lives were cut way too short. As always, let me know your thoughts on these cases in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe.